Great. Just trying to get a hold of Senator Tarr, but yeah, Brad, if you wanted to just give us an update on anything to do with budget or legislation or budget forecast or wherever you think you can give us the good news first.
Well,
Please.
I think first of all, before I begin, this is for the committee members of the Board of Selectmen. We have been in contact with your leaders, so your two town managers and your superintendent since the beginning of this crisis. And I want you all to know how hard they have worked and how much they have been in contact with our office throughout this entire crisis and the wonderful job that they've been doing. We've been trying to keep them as updated as we possibly can. As we get news, we forward it to them. And if they have any questions on bills that are before us, we've been working very closely with each other to make sure that we can get the answers that we need so that they can run the town and the school district in a very responsible way. So a big thank you to the two town managers and to Julie for a wonderful, wonderful job and partnership that you've had with Senator Tarr and I throughout this crisis. We appreciate it. During a meeting I had a few weeks ago with the Hamilton Wenham School Committee, I said this is a day-to-day, hour-to-hour situation where things pop up, and sometimes it takes a while to get answers to your questions. But I think overall, it's been a very good partnership, and I just want to say thank you for it because it has been a very busy 8 weeks for all of us, and I think we're getting through what we need to get through. Actually, today Senator Tarr and I were on a conference call with the governor, and the very first question that we had for him had to do with local aid for this fiscal year. When I talked with the Hamilton Wenham School Committee a few weeks ago, I was concerned that we may have to see some cuts during this fiscal year to local aid, whether it be the school Chapter 70 formula or UGA account. And I'm happy to report that the governor feels strongly that with the help of the federal government that we've been getting over the last few weeks and the bills that have been passed, he thinks we're going to get to the finish line without having to see 9C cuts or to see any cuts to local aid. Moving forward into 2021, he's very concerned that we might not get the help that we've been getting from the federal government. My understanding is they've already spent about $3 trillion in this crisis. And moving forward, we just don't know how we can continue getting those type of funds to the states. But with that said, we have over the last few years worked very hard to make sure that our rainy day account gets filled back up. At one point it was below $1 billion, and we're up to almost $3.5 billion in that rainy day account as we speak today. And a lot of that is going to be used for budgetary reasons going into FY21. We have had some economic people come in and talk to us. And we're expecting that the revenue drop could be between $2.5 to $4 billion for 2021 over, what we had expected to see over the last this year and going into next year. But again, with the rainy day fund, things may not be as bad as they could have been. Not even could have been, would have been, had we not put that money into those accounts. We're hearing loud and clear from the school district specifically. We just started the new program with the new education bill last year. And, we want to try and make sure that we can keep our promise, or at least keep to the theme of getting more money to our education folks. And Senator Tarr and I have been working very hard with our respective branches to let them know how we feel about that. And I know I'm not the only one advocating for more education funding moving into 2021. But if I had to make a guess, we're probably not going to see the increases we had hoped we would see going into 2021 for education funding, only because of the drop in revenues that we're going to see. The governor, as you probably know, has set up a committee looking at how we're going to open up the economy. It's being headed by Lieutenant Governor Polito, and she's been meeting feverishly over the last few days, and her committee, with a bunch of businesses, both small and big, who are talking with her and letting her know how they feel they could be essential to the economy and how they could open up in a safe manner. And it's my understanding that when we do start opening up the economy, it's going to be done in a phased-in manner. So it's not going to come, let's say, for example, May 18th, and we're going to snap our finger and every single restaurant and every single retail store is going to be back open. That's not going to be the case. It's going to be phased in over weeks, if not months. And we'll get more details on that when the governor and the lieutenant governor do the press conferences to let us know how these meetings are going. But I think, again, financially for this fiscal year, I'm pretty optimistic, which I wasn't a couple of weeks ago, that we should be okay. We're going to crawl to the finish line of fiscal year 2020, but I think we're going to get there. And again, with the help of the federal government, we will get there, from what the governor feels. And he was pretty optimistic about that during our phone call today. There's still some legislation that's been out there that I think we could help some of our cities and towns when it comes to town meetings and things of that sort. I actually got some questions over the last couple of days about Hamilton and Wenham specifically and their town meetings. One of the questions was, as of today, and I'll use Wenham as the example, if they wanted to hold their town meeting over at the Hamilton Wenham High School, is that something that's allowed by law? And the answer as of today is no. You have to have the town meeting within the boundaries of your town borders. However, there is a bill before us that would allow you to do that. And the House and the Senate are deliberating that bill as we speak. Interestingly enough, tomorrow the House, for the first time, is going to try voting from home. We're going to be debating from home. And we're doing a test on that tomorrow with a non-controversial bill to see how it would work and see how the voting would take place to make sure that there's no issue so that these other bills can start being debated, because they need to be. There were a couple of coronavirus cases at the State House, and there's many of us who still feel a little uncomfortable about going into the State House, especially into the chambers that are, small. And if you've ever been to one of our sessions when we're all in the chambers together, it's very crowded and we're all very close to each other, certainly not within the 6 feet of our distancing. So we're going to try this tomorrow, see how it goes. And if we can get through it pretty smoothly, we're going to see some other bills start popping up similar to the one I just spoke about. So that's a little bit about what's going on financially for this fiscal year, and again, moving into next fiscal year. Does anybody have any questions regarding that? Oh, and by the way, I didn't, if I can just, I'm sorry, my fault. I didn't talk about the lottery, but the lottery number, which is the big number for the cities and towns, is way, 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 way down. The revenue picture for that is, I think, between 30 and 40% drop already in just 8 weeks. And of course, that number is going to continue to go down unless we can get some of our restaurants opened where they were playing Keno, and some of the big prizes across the country aren't happening because people are not betting on those lotteries like they were before this crisis. And that's one of the reasons the UGA may drop, is because a big piece of UGA is the lottery number. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. Hi, Brad. I had a question on the Zoom meeting that you and your chamber will be having. Will that be a public meeting? And if so,
it's not going to be a Zoom meeting, actually.
Okay.
I am going to be watching it online just like everybody else normally would. And when I go to vote, I have to call in my vote to a monitor, and the monitor will take my vote and then give it to the clerk on my behalf. Any debate that takes place, I have to phone it in. Well, first of all, I actually have to let them know at 10 o'clock in the morning if I want to debate on a bill, and I will be put on a list, and then I'm going to have to go on the phone, which will then go through the streaming system for everybody to hear. So we were concerned with the Zoom at this point because of some of the things we've been hearing about it and how people can get into it. And we were concerned about that, or at least the speaker was. I thought there was other platforms we could have used personally, but since that didn't happen, everything's being done by phone. You can watch it, you can on the streaming that we do every session. I will be watching the same streaming and then calling in my vote.
thank you.
So Senator Tarr is online, but he's in the, I I think he's in the attendees. Is it possible for you to just unmute him, Vinny?
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you.
Vinny, unmute John Clemenzi too, please.
Bruce should be.
Good afternoon. This is Bruce, and I hope that I have finally been unmuted.
You have been, Bruce.
This
Well,
may be
thank
the first time we ever know how to mute Bruce. We got to keep this on our record here.
That was Brad, by the way.
Yeah, I that is duly noted. I am making notes of that.
He'll get me back within minutes, I'm sure.
So, I would just point out, in response to Darcy's question, that in the Senate, we do continue to meet in informal session, as well as the House does in most cases, and those are being live streamed. And so you can watch each and every one of those sessions. And I think an important point, Brad made reference to the issues that we're having relative to tax revenue. And the numbers that came out today were very discouraging in terms of a shortfall in April that exceeds $2 billion. But it's important to remember that part of that shortfall is attributable to the postponement of the due date for income tax payments. And so when you take away what we anticipate is that timing discrepancy, the actual amount of the shortfall is sufficiently less, or significantly less, I'm sorry. But in order to cover that gap, we are going to need to do some borrowing. And that's the reason that the House needs to come into formal session, and we will as well when they're completed with this task. We have to pass what's called a RANS bill, a revenue anticipation note bill, so that essentially the state will sell bonds and pay them back in a very short period of time to have enough money to meet our cash flow requirements. And we'll be able to repay those bonds when people pay their income tax and when we get some additional revenue from the federal government. And so under the US Constitution, the state constitution, I'm sorry, we have to have a recorded roll call vote in order to borrow money. And so ultimately the House will have to approve this particular bill, the RANS bill, by a 2/3 vote, and the Senate will have to do it by a 2/3 vote as well. And so it is important to understand that we feel fairly confident that we'll be able to meet our obligations for the remainder of the fiscal year, but doing so will depend on borrowing using this short-term vehicle. And that is why both the House and the Senate have to figure out a way to conduct a formal session. And Brad and his colleagues have spent a lot of time sorting that out. In the House, it's a little bit different because there are 160 members. With us, there are only 40 members. We have devised a plan, and we will be ready to take that formal vote after the House sends the bill to us. Because again, under the state constitution, this type of a bill has to originate in the House. And so we anticipate that all will go smoothly, and we'll be able to meet things like our last local aid payments and our payments to school districts. Obviously, when we get into the next fiscal year, that is going to be a much more challenging situation. And some of the information that became available today indicates that, according to some of the models, we could be facing an unemployment rate, at least initially, of 24 to 26%. And that will be very hard in the first quarter. Some of the economists are predicting it could be even more difficult in the second quarter. So we've got an uphill climb to face here. And clearly the stabilization fund, as Brad mentioned, is very helpful to have, but it's also important to remember that it will likely be a fairly long time before we can replenish the stabilization fund. So we have to withdraw from it very carefully and in a very measured way. And in order to be able to do that, one of the things that we're doing in terms of a rule to follow is trying to make sure that we maximize every amount of federal reimbursement that we can possibly get, so that anything the federal government will pay for, we try to use those dollars for that and minimize the need to withdraw from the stabilization fund.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Catherine Harrison. Brad or Bruce, do you have any sense, I know there's so many unknowns, but any sense of what your budget, I don't want to even say timeline, but your budget process is going to look like for FY21 in terms of, when you imagine things might begin and when a budget might be available? And are you going to be able to budget for an entire year, given that, you might be able to predict Q1, but not Q2? Any thoughts on?
Well, I can speak for the House side. We actually were supposed to take up the budget last week, and that never happened because of what happened with the crisis. My understanding is we're waiting to get better numbers, because we still are getting different numbers every day of what next year would look like. I do know Chairman Michaelwitz and the Speaker, as well as the President and Chairman Rodrick, are now looking at possibly doing one budget, which is not normal for us. Usually the House would do a budget, and then the Senate would do its version, and then we would hash it out. So there's talk that at some point of putting out one budget from both branches. However, with that said, absent that happening, we're looking at probably doing a 1/12 budget. We will definitely not have a budget in place by July 1st. That I can assure you. But moving forward, my hope would be that the House would see something in the middle of June, actually, and that we could start maybe having a debate on that particular document, and then put out the 1/12 budget, which we have allowed cities and towns and school districts to do as well. And then we would work into the fall, I think, and I believe, and Bruce will give his opinion, before we'll see a final product. Because like we said, day to day, and the big question mark, Catherine, is going to be how are the federal government, how are they going to help us? They can't continue to be passing bills that, total $3 trillion and not see something bad happen to the United States economy. So I would say for us, we're going to start with 1/12 in July, and then moving forward, it would be probably mid-fall before we could see something final.
Okay, thank you.
So, Catherine, I would add to that. First of all, we started in January with a consensus revenue estimate that is now almost totally irrelevant.
Right.
And so there was a second joint revenue hearing that happened just a short time ago. And I think Brad may have already made reference to this, but on average, the economists predicted that we would have a shortfall from what we had predicted in January of somewhere between 4 and 5 billion with a B dollars. And so that has really given us pause to think about how we're going to proceed. And one of the elements here, and you alluded to it, is volatility. So what appears to be the case is that hopefully we could work from a singular budget. And that's been suggested, that the House and the Senate might use one vehicle instead of the traditional method of the House doing a budget and then the Senate doing a budget. And then, as you all know, there is a lengthy negotiation between the two. There's been some discussion of having maybe a unitary document that we would all work through in order to expedite things. That being said, I do agree with Brad. I think it's very unlikely that we will see the usual process. And so I would predict that we will have one or more interim budgets. And the discussion that's been happening is along the lines of, should we do a 1/12 budget, or should we do quarterly budgets for a while? Or should we do a 1/12 budget and then a 6-month budget? So there are a lot of different permutations that are being discussed. And most of the variability centers around the volatility in revenue projections. So it may make more sense to take smaller bites of the budget, knowing that the numbers that we're using would be somewhat more reliable than if we try to project out for a whole year. So it's unclear exactly how that's going to play out, but there's a lot of discussion going on about it right now.
Thank you, Bruce.
So, sort of playing off to that same idea, when we don't know what the money from the state is going to be, and we also don't, we have that same volatility, but we don't seem to have that same option to have, to approve our budget in chunks. What kind of advice would you give us? Because many of us are going to say 1/12 of what we had last year is a significant cut in our budgets because we have obligations that are going to increase. So I didn't know if you had some advice for how we should proceed with our budget process.
Well, my advice would be that you move forward thinking that you could see a 20% cut to your local aid. During, and Bruce, please correct me if I'm wrong, but during the last, Bruce and I have been around a long time. We've been through two downward turns in the economy. And in both cases, we saw up to 20% cut in Chapter 70 and local aid. So using that as a barometer, that's me personally, I would suggest that we should look at that again, because that seems to be the number we use when we are cutting local aid. My hope is, as I said earlier in my comments, that because of what we did last year with the education bill, that we wouldn't see such a cut. But moving forward, just like the state, when we do our 1/12 budget, it's going to be like we're making cuts as well, because normally what would happen is we would look at last year's budget and just follow that until we can get something passed. So my advice to you folks would be, let's use a 20% cut. And if that doesn't happen, great. But I don't want you to be not doing that. And then all of a sudden, like Bruce, again, I think it was 2013, mid-year, we had a 20% cut during the fiscal year, which decimated a lot of school districts' budgets and, of course, municipalities as well. That would be my advice. I don't know if Bruce has a different opinion on that.
Well, I would suggest that the numbers that Brad is using are unfortunately somewhere in the realm of possibility. But I would also point out that during the time of the pandemic, through special legislation that was passed, we did give the ability for cities and towns to do 1/12 budgets or interim budgets. And it may be that we would extend that. So we need to keep you posted about that, because we do recognize that without further guidance from us, it's hard for you to conduct a whole year's budgeting process. Now, the reason that we allow interim budgets or incremental budgets right now is because we realize that we've had to forestall town meetings. But it might be that because of the instability of the state budget.
Whoops,
We just lost.
we just lost Bruce.
Yeah.
He must have been driving near somewhere around here where we need some more cell phone tower coverage.
Bruce is on there. He just is muted out right now.
Huh.
Yeah. Is that, maybe Vinny can unmute him.
He's in there as an attendee. Give me
Also,
1 second.
Brad, my other kind of question is so, we're looking at possibly having our town meetings on June 20th. Do you see that the governor's going to allow gatherings of, 200, 250 people by that time? Or how is that decision-making process happening? Or do you have any insight to that?
So what's been happening is, and this was a question that came up yesterday as well, and I forgot to mention it during my opening remarks. Some towns are actually looking at lowering the quorum, and a bill that is before us right now, I apologize for that, that is before us right now would allow folks to maybe do that, or the discussions would happen. The town of Marblehead actually popped up, but they lowered their quorum to 30 people from 300. But that was not legislatively done, actually. That was done through. So there's a big difference. They wanted to do it as soon as possible. They took it to court, and the judge agreed with them. And they said 10% of whatever your quorum is what we'll allow you. So it would be 30. With that said, they know that there could be 150 or 200 people that would show up to a town meeting. And what's happening is we're seeing a lot of towns actually try and look at outside venues, setting up tents so that people would be separated by the 6 feet criteria. I think the 10 gathering of 10 may be relaxed as we move forward into June and July. Like I said, the committee is looking at all of these things, and that is going to be a big question. When does that get lifted? And I think before the June deadlines, and again, my opinion only, we would see that gathering of 10 may be lifted a little bit. Certainly towns are looking at, wearing masks at some of these town meetings, but a lot of them are actually looking outside and seeing what they can do at football fields or parking lots. There was one held actually last year at a parking lot because something happened at a inside venue, and it worked very well. They had a speaker set up, and the moderator held it in a parking lot at a high school. So that's how right now people are looking at trying to get around the gathering of 10.
So if I could add to that, if you would just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
I have to think that somebody is enjoying muting me an awful lot because it's so hard to do. But I would suggest that the bill that the Senate has acted on and sent over to the House would allow every municipality, particularly with open town meeting, to reduce the number to not lower than 10% of the existing quorum requirement. And that would be done by the Board of Selectmen in consultation with the moderator and the disability coordinator for the community to make sure there's access for everyone in the community. So that would be part of it. And additionally, it would allow for the meeting to be held, as Brad mentioned, in a remote location, not necessarily within the borders of the community. So that legislation is moving. And, sometimes it takes the House a while. I had to get Brad back. So hopefully they'll take that up. But I have a fair degree of confidence that will pass. And I also just quickly looked up some of the cuts that we had to make during the Great Recession. So fiscal year 09 and fiscal year 10, just as a frame of reference, so you could see what we did then. And these were numbers over a 2-year period. So please keep that in mind. But in that time, we reduced unrestricted general government aid, or UGA, as we call it, by 28.8%. In terms of the circuit breaker for special education, that was reduced by 42.1%. Regional school transportation was reduced by 30.5%. And I think those would be the relevant things that we might talk about on this call. So again, bear in mind that what I've just cited are things that happened over 2 fiscal years. And we're talking about maybe having those same levels of reductions in 1 fiscal year.
And Michelle, just to let you know, the bill that Bruce was talking about, we also would allow towns to be able to vote from home as well. So we're opening that up for people to consider if they wanted to. If people were concerned about going to a town meeting, that you folks could work together to do all of that remotely as well.
Although I would caution that the current version of the bill allows that only for representative town meetings.
Right.
So for open town meeting, the House would have to modify that to expand it.
Correct.
Yeah, so I'm also have a question, Bruce and Brad, it's Sean here. We have our elections and our bylaw tied to our town meeting. If some worst case scenario happens and we don't have a ATM and we have to go to the 1/12 budget, et cetera, for the year, how will we handle our elections that are tied to our town meeting date?
I believe we would have, Bruce, correct me if I'm wrong, but we would have to look at the legislation making its way through, and we would have to change some language for that to happen.
We would, Sean. We've already allowed postponement of town elections in one of the prior municipal relief bills, but the scope of that bill didn't contemplate the time period that we'll be going into soon. So we'll likely have to revisit that.
Okay.
I would point out one other piece that's in the bill that the Senate sent to the House, and that we hope the House will act on expeditiously. And that is the ability for school districts to pay for services that are not necessarily being rendered at the present time. So some school districts have raised issues, particularly relative to school transportation, about the disruption in their contracts with vendors, because current state law says you can't pay for anything unless you actually receive the services. And so that's come up in the context of special education collaboratives, regional collaboratives, and transportation companies, where it may be advantageous for communities to continue paying them, notwithstanding the restrictions that are in the current law. So there is optional relief in that bill to allow you to pay for things, even though some of the services may not actually being delivered at the present time.
Would that be the same with the municipalities, Bruce? I'm just thinking if we move to a 112
Yes.
budget, we're not going to be even every month. We're going to have bills that come due at different times. So, you know, working with those vendors and the governor would be great.
All
I think-
cities and towns and school districts.
Senator, just so that I'm sure you're aware of this, students are still receiving services from our collaborative partners in the same way that we're delivering remote learning services to our students. The one issue that we have is with our some of our special education transportation, where we don't have a contracted agreement in place currently.
So I appreciate that. And my understanding was that in some collaboratives, some of the students are attending, but maybe not all. And so that's why also we're trying to provide some of that relief. But I appreciate the point about the transportation very much.
Mm-hmm.
So just so that I understand, in present legislation would allow us to postpone town meetings on our budget approval till after June 30th, but requires us to have an election before that. Sometimes the elections are tied to the bylaws and we have our own issue with that. But did I hear someone say that election date might be changed or allowed to be more flexible through legislation?
I think there's a strong possibility of that, Catherine, as time goes by. When we passed the original bills, we did not know necessarily the endurance of this event. So I suspect that we are going to revisit it.
And it's sorry to everyone who this doesn't involve, but it's of particular importance in Wenham, well, possibly in Hamilton, because our election not only includes people, but if things were to stay the same, and who knows if they will from a budget point of view, it includes override and debt exclusion articles are on the ballot. So having elections, being forced to disconnect them too much from town meeting or having them before town meeting makes that particularly difficult for towns like ours.
It's a point well taken. If I could, I'd like to revisit for just a moment the whole issue, and Brad, I think, laid this out pretty well. But I'd like to revisit the issue of when we'll be able to gather together again. And obviously, in the last few days, much has been made about the May 18th timeline. But I think it's important for folks to remember that May 18th is the timeline for the committee on reopening, the reopening advisory board, to make its report. It's not likely that things will happen immediately that day or even the following day, and that what will happen with reopening is it will be gradual. But even more importantly than that, and Brad and I clarified this with the governor today, that what will drive the reopening, much more than the plan, will be certain health indicators, like rates of hospitalization and death rates and rates of new positive tests. Those things will have to all be moving in the right direction before there will be any significant change in things like the gathering order relative to less than 10 people. So I would just remind folks that while we're making plans, because we need to, for what happens when we can begin to change things, that things really won't be allowed to change until the health indicators are all moving in the right direction. So it may be a significantly longer period of time than the May 18th timeframe that we've all been talking about.
Well, Bruce, I have to, speaking only for myself, say that I'm very, I've been listening to the governor say that just about every day in his briefings, and I could not be more proud of our administration, you guys all included, for holding on to that health guideline as being the line in the sand. One person only, but I think that's absolutely prudent, and we'll figure things out. But let's all stay healthy and alive. It sounds kind of trite, but I think a point well taken. But it does speak to the fact that we're going to need more legislative flexibility so that we can move forward, pay our bills, but also have our town meetings and our elections when it's safe to do that. So thank you.
We understand that, and that's why our partnership, which we have always prized very highly, is even more important now, so that we can work together to navigate these challenging times. And it may require significant numbers of additional pieces of legislation, but both Brad and I are committed to doing that, and our colleagues are as well. So as we have to adapt and evolve, we're prepared to do that.
So one more, I want to go back to that 20%. When you're talking about 20% in local aid, would you also then apply that same 20% reduction to regional transportation and circuit breaker reimbursement?
Yeah, I would say that those have been, and I think Bruce gave you the numbers from the last crisis that we had. And again, those were over 2 years. So each year we saw a little cut and then another cut after that. Those are big ones that we really are fighting for. And I would like to tell you that they wouldn't be 20%, but I'm giving you a forewarning that you should probably budget that way. And then if it comes in better than that, great. Once we start seeing what the revenue picture would be. And like Bruce said earlier, I mean, we're going to know in July, what we should have received in April. We're going to see it, we hope, in July. And that could change the picture, drastically from what we're being told right now. And I just don't want you to be budgeting something, then all of a sudden mid-year, we come in and say, I'm sorry, but we're going to take this money away. So in good conscience, I think I have to tell you that use 20% as the round figure for cuts. And then if anything comes in smaller than that, it's great. We're going to be pushing for smaller cuts. And I can attest to this. I've already talked to many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that are not happy that we may have to see cuts to this bill that we just passed and that we were also very proud of. And so when we start debating the budget again, I can assure you that the education funding is going to be one of the top priorities of just about everybody in the legislature. But what I would warn you about, and I'm sure some of you get the magazines that we all get from all the different groups, but there's a lot of groups out there telling us that we should not be funding education next year, that we should be putting it on hold. Senator Tarr and I worked very hard with our colleagues to try and expedite the retirement fund that we have to pay into every year so that we would pay 100% of our unfunded pension liability. I believe it was 2037. We're even being asked, don't do that, move it out again, and take these dollars and make sure that we fund essential services. That was a report that came out just yesterday from one major group, and they're not alone. So we're going to be your voice when it comes to these debates. And I'm only speaking for myself, but I know Bruce and I talk regularly about this. Education is going to be a top priority for the majority of my colleagues in both the House and the Senate because of what we did last year and the promise that we made.
Yeah. One of our issues is, so even when extra money comes in, if we've already passed a budget, we can't spend it in this year because we can't spend beyond that. So it really just is money that rolls into E&D for the next year. And so the sooner we can get like an estimate that we can count on, the better, because the extra money after we approve the budget doesn't really help our position.
Yeah, you don't do the special town meetings. A lot of other towns do in the fall, where they then can use those dollars once the new numbers have come in. So I get it.
Yeah.
Interesting. So are you saying that we can if the money comes in higher, that then if we had a special town meeting, we could take that and add it to the budget?
I believe you can go back and take action on anything that you've done in the annual town meeting, and I would ask the town managers to kick in case I'm wrong about that. But I know in Ipswich, for example, a couple of years, we didn't get our Chapter 90 money until after July 1st. And once we received it, we went to a special town meeting, and we were then able to accept that money and spend that money. So Anthony.
Yeah, Brad, I would agree with you. It's just like one of our strategies right now that we're talking about is holding off on maybe some of our capital items until the fall town meeting. We're questioning whether or not we can have a full town meeting, and the social distancing guidelines would be lifted enough to do that. So in the event that even that is possible, we're discussing it tonight, but maybe just dealing with the financial articles that we have to for the budget, and then kicking some stuff and anticipate a fall town meeting. And then at that point, yes, you could appropriate, we've done it before with excess overlay, and we could do CIP items, anything else that maybe some kind of windfall cash that Bruce and Brad can help us get from the state would be great.
Yeah, that would be amazing, because when they work so hard for us not to be able to use it, it's a waste. So if we can all work together on that, that would be fantastic.
And by the way, let me just add to what I said earlier about Marblehead. When they changed their quorum to 30, they are only taking up warrant articles that deal with the budget. And there's 16 of them, and they're not dealing with anything else. Everything else has been taken off the table. Isn't that a lot of what's going on?
And isn't that legislation, Bruce, that you forwarded over to our office? Doesn't that even one of the stipulations that it would only deal with financial articles?
That's correct.
Right.
And I would just reiterate the commitment that Brad has made. If we're fortunate enough to have a change in our situation, and we have more revenue than we had predicted, then Brad and I will be absolutely committed to making returning funds to our municipalities and school districts a priority. And I do think the rest of our colleagues share that same priority.
I remember a few years back, and Joe and Anthony, again, refresh my memory if I'm wrong, we actually passed a bill. We had some extra revenue, and we added more money to the UGR account, and many of the towns that had the special town meetings in the fall accepted those dollars after July 1st, and they were allowed to put them into their budget or wherever they chose to put those dollars. And that was mid-year in a fiscal year. And I think it was 2 or 3 years ago that we did that. Because again, we had some extra dollars that we wanted to give back to our communities.
Yep, that is correct. We can do that.
Can I get a little clarification on changing the quorum numbers to a lower number? That would just be the minimum required, right? There wouldn't be a cap on anything, would it?
Correct. It would be a minimum.
So, okay. And how much influence does the legislature have in sort of pushing for, to the Polito campaign, not related, in what should open, it could open first. I think there's some low hanging fruit in the fact that dispensaries have been closed while liquor stores have been open during this, that we could actually be getting a lot of, revenue from that, just off the top of my head, and you guys know way more than me, but I'd hope that would sort of open sooner rather than later, just seeing it as low hanging fruit.
So right now, what I would recommend, David, is tell as many small businesses and big businesses to get on the link and send testimony into that committee. They are literally reading every piece of document according to what the governor said today, and the lieutenant governor. She was on the line as well, so that they can come up with a report for May 18th. They are listening to us, and I know that particular issue has come up, as well as golf courses. People want to be able to get back on the golf courses, and that was something that I've gotten more emails about that than I have unemployment over the last few days. That people want to be able to go back out and, if I can go to Bradley Palmer State Park, where it was so crowded they had to close the place, but I can't go on a golf course, which if you're a golfer like me, you're never near somebody else after you hit your ball.
You're in the woods, Brad?
Say that again?
In the rough.
Where are you? In the woods?
I go to Wenham, and my first ball always goes into the cemetery. You can guarantee it every time I hit the ball.
I
But
can attest to that.
yes, you can. But Dave, they need to go to the link, and they need to testify, and they need to send in why they would be essential, but more importantly, if they were to be able to be open, how would they make it safe for the patrons that come into their establishments? But they're listening. They want to hear from small businesses, and I would urge as many people who are on this Zoom call, if you something you care about, go to the link. It's on mass.gov. Hit the link and send in your testimony. It's important.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you.
Brad and Bruce, obviously the general fund and the school budgets are priorities, but what about things like the CPA? I imagine things look pretty grim there.
Well, I would suggest that there's probably no aspect of the state budget that will be left untouched by this. It's a question of degree. And we have both been fighting particularly hard lately to get some additional support for CPA. But of course, as you know, part of the fund for that comes from recording fees at the Registry of Deeds. And it's still uncertain as to what's going to happen to those fees, but that will present an element of volatility.
Yeah. So,
And I would just add, Jeff, over the last couple of years, we've actually taken reversion money from the state budget, and we've put some of those dollars into the CPA because so many cities and towns have now joined the CPA program. And as you probably know, Boston has now joined, which has taken a lot of money from that account. And where you may have seen between, let's say, 75% and 100% reimbursement 5 to 10 years ago, you're seeing probably in the 20s, 30s, and 40s right now. So we took reversion money and added that to the account of what Bruce just talked about with the recording fees. But overall, those fees are paid to cities and towns through the recording fees. We don't have a line item in the budget. We added something after the fact because we heard loud and clear what a successful program that's been and how could we help. And that was the best we could do for now, moving forward.
Great, thank you.
Do we know, will the MSBA funding, will that get frozen at all, or?
Well, let me just, and Bruce can add to this as well, but that's a big concern, again, because of the sales tax. And 1 cent of the sales tax goes into paying for the SBA, the MSBA program. And if we continue to see a drop in the sales tax, which we've seen a huge drop over the last 8 weeks, that is going to affect the amount of money that they get for school projects. I have not had a conversation with the MSBA board to see if they're going to be freezing anything. I do know Manchester Essex Regional School District is in the process of building their elementary school. It's moving forward. Those dollars have not been frozen, but it's a good conversation. And Bruce, I don't know if you've had a conversation with them to see if they're freezing anything, but my concern would be that the drop in the sales tax is going to be a drop in the funds that we give them automatically year after year.
So I haven't had a conversation with them directly, but obviously the reduction in the sales tax revenues is going to dramatically impact them. I have not heard them articulate a plan yet for how they may deal with that.
This is where it's good that we actually didn't get accepted last year or the year before, because it would actually push us out a few years when they can actually rebuild the coffers.
So before all of this, we all marched to the deadlines that was going to put us at a town meeting at the 1st of April, and everybody has an approved budget and it's all ready to go. But we probably need to revisit that. So it sounds like their guidance is for the school and for the towns to expect 20% less state aid. The school district and the town of Wenham were already looking at more than 2.5% for the proposition overrides. So it sounds to me like we should be going back and revisiting those budgets. And I'm just wondering for the people here, if there's a process you wanted to talk about for us to get together and understand the new challenges that we're having. Normally we would do that before we approve budgets, and now it's kind of like we're back to the drawing board.
Well, I think anybody who's doing budgeting, whether it be a state or federal or locally, we're all going back and revisiting every budget that we've done. There was a couple of supplemental budgets that we had hoped to pass before this all happened that haven't passed either, because again, the revenue picture isn't as strong as we had hoped. I'm sorry to say that, yes, I think you do need to go back and revisit it. It would probably be the prudent thing to do. We're doing it at the state level, and I think locally, we all have to take a hard look at what has been passed. I apologize for that. But again, I'm going by what has happened the last couple of crises, and I just want you to be prepared. I don't want these mid cuts. It was brutal for any of you who weren't there to see these cuts mid-year. It was awful.
So I'm wondering if there's any value in really pushing to have a town meeting in June, and if we would be better off just embracing the 1/12 for July and August and thinking forward to the fall. I'm just kind of thinking out loud about that.
Yeah, but you're also going to Melrose in July.
Well, from what I know, but I think there would be more, I don't know.
From what I understand, there are very big bills that come in the middle of summer, and it's not like all the payments are equal times 12. So there's going to be, a trough and a height of the wave when these payments come in. So I guess we were trying to head that off so we wouldn't have to deal with that. I think that was the goal.
Yeah, if I could add, the 1/12 budget will be based on what your previously approved budget was for the previous year. So you'd be looking at a minimum of a 1/12 of the previous year's budget. And we really don't know if that's the right place to be operating in. There's something to be said for trying to forecast the best we can. Hamilton gets the vast majority of its revenues from property taxes, not from the state. So there's a really good case to be made that we should be making our best conservative estimate on what we can expect for property tax revenue and go from there. But that's just, again, thinking out loud. It's a debate that still has to be had.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns for the schools is all of this talk that maybe schools won't reopen in the fall, and the economic and facility challenges that would raise, not to mention what it would cost for parents to still have their children at home when they're usually, being cared for by someone else at school. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, and I know there's a lot of uncertainty for the town as well, but it may be that the whole way we deliver education is completely different. And so we don't have estimates for what different looks like, because we don't even know if different, we don't even know is our biggest issue. But I, as a citizen, I would still express the concern that if the governor says we shouldn't be gathering in groups of more than 25, we probably shouldn't be having a town meeting, just because the quorum is low doesn't mean that you can stop people from coming. So I just, and also one thing that was brought up on a call was that obviously the towns pay their assessment monthly, but perhaps there could be an agreement that, in June and July, or not June, July and August, the assessment could be reduced some, and then, made up in September, possibly, when you do know what your budget is, if we were to move town meeting even forward and more. So. But I think the school committee is going to have to make decisions about cuts, but we need to understand like where that level needs to be based on what the town is still needing. And because we don't all meet together, we don't really know what the challenges are for each other. So I just am curious if the local people feel the need to meet more another time, or if we just want to.
Well, the school department definitely needs some direction, because even, and we were just looking at reducing chapter 70 by 20%, that's $800,000 to the school budget, which is significant, as you all know. We don't really have anywhere to go in this budget except people. And so that also means that we have contractual obligations in terms of notifying people whether or not they have jobs. So we have the June 15th deadline for our non-professional status folks. We clearly won't have a budget by then. But even if we were able to have town meeting by June 20th, it then pushes us into July in terms of notifying staff whether or not they have employment in the next fiscal year. So I think those are important dates to keep in mind as we're thinking about timeline, and also how far we need to go in terms of notifying people, because $800,000, that's, if you were just thinking on average $80,000 per teaching position for salary and benefits, that's 10 teachers. That is going to dramatically impact the school district. And so if we're needing to go further, then we need to be preparing. I mean, we've been preparing. We have sort of like what if scenarios. I don't know, I think we're up to like 6 or 7 what if scenarios right now, but having some sort of direction as to what the communities will be able to support is going to be essential in making sure that we're being ethical and moral as well.
So Brad and Bruce, can I just ask you a clarifying question? You said a 20% reduction to chapter 70, but I also heard you mention 30% to transportation and 40% to circuit breaker. I know those were what happened in the past. Do you foresee the same percent for transportation circuit breaker, or should we be using 20% across the board?
So I think Bruce gave you an update of what happened over a 2-year period, 2 fiscal year period earlier. There was, I think, a cut of like 15 to 18% one year, and then there was an additional cut the year after that. I would say probably a 20% cut across the board moving forward. And I'm not going to lie to you, I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can regarding education because of what we did last year. But I just want you to be prepared just in case.
And is that 20% to our current level in 20, or what the House put out in January?
That would probably be a 20% cut of what you're getting in 20.
Okay. Thank
Bruce,
you.
do you agree with that?
I do, and I did just want to emphasize the numbers I gave you were for the 2-year period in fiscal year 09 and fiscal year 10. And I also want to give the strongest caveat that I possibly can, that we are operating here from past experience, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And I think that what we're trying to make sure is that you plan for something that's realistic so that there are no surprises. We'd rather have you deal with a windfall than with a greater loss than you were expecting. So we really don't know at this point what the numbers are going to look like, but we're trying to convey a sense of the scope of what you might be facing, the order of magnitude.
Michelle, to your earlier point, I cannot imagine a scenario that we can go forward, either town and the schools, without working very closely together, and not even just at a management level, but at the school committee, selectmen, finance committee levels. There might be some big meetings, but we really need to have some sort of brainstorming think tank, since we're so intertwined. And it's hard to do that, especially in this situation, but I think we need to figure out a way. I don't see how any of us can put together any kind of a budget without having a clear understanding of what the other parties can do.
Yeah, I'd agree, Catherine. And maybe Anthony, Joe, and Julie can work out a schedule that would make the most sense for us to touch base with one another.
No, that sounds great. And also maybe the FinComs want to join.
Yep.
They know the town budget's inside and out, and where all of the little, I don't know, slivers are hanging out. So it would be super nice for that. And I know it's unmanageable, but I think that we've all gotten really good at mute, unmute, and taking turns. So the bigger group, it actually might be easier for all of us to be on this situation. So,
No, good idea to include the finance committees.
it was very generous of Brad and Bruce to join us today with their time, and especially, like I said, I know you guys are working hard every single day to understand a very evolving situation. So, and just the legislation that you put through in the first 3 or 4 weeks has been a lot. And it's also probably been a bigger political challenge because you've had to get everyone to agree 100%. And that is way more difficult than it is to just get a majority vote. So we appreciate that.
It's true. We've been operating on a complete consensus basis. And I think it speaks volumes about the place that we live in, and the fact that we've been able to get bipartisan compromise and consensus. And we hope to continue to do that. We're not going to be able to do a lot of formal sessions going forward. We'll have to do some, but I do think it's been encouraging. And, we appreciate the ability to work with our colleagues and to work with you. So we want to stay in close communication as well with all of you.
Great. Okay. Are there any other questions, even if you're in the chat room or anybody here?
I just want to thank Bruce and Brad for all you've done over the years to help with our school district and really fight for getting us the funding that we need, especially trying to get more regional busing money. And even if we can get that school, the special ed transportation with the Student Opportunity Act, if we can get that funding. I mean, as you know, we've got a lot of rising costs, and any little money to help our school district would be so helpful. Just to get, to get flexibility, with special education would be helpful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're going to do the best we can with what we have.
All right. Do various boards want to adjourn?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off with the Hamilton Board of Selectmen. Darcy, do you have a motion?
Yes, I have a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Great. All right, Sean, we'll start with you.
Sean Farrell, aye.
Darcy?
Darcy Dale, aye.
Rosie, is she still here?
Yep. Rosie,
Oh, there you are.
Rosie Kennedy, aye.
All right. Jeff Hubbard, aye. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Brad,
you.
Bruce.
Bruce
Much
and Brad.
appreciated.
Bruce and Brad, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Michelle and school committee, thanks for organizing this. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe. See you later.
I would move that the Hamilton Wenham Regional School Committee adjourn.
Second?
Michelle Horgan,
Yes.
Ty Prima, Peter Walczyk,
Yes.
Michelle Bailey,
Yes.
Stacy Metternich.
Yes.
Ty, you there? All right. I'm a yes. I guess we'll go without Ty. I got you right, Michelle Horgan. All right. So thanks, guys. See you
right,
tomorrow
Thanks,
night.
Michelle.
So,
Since it's news that we don't have a quorum, we have no
Yeah,
action.
right. You just adjourned yourself.
Party of one, Catherine.
One. My favorite kind of party these days.
Margaritas
you.
for everybody now.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, Catherine. Be
All right.
well.
You too.